Hey, so we're very happy to have Mike Mueller-Smith presenting for us today. Mike is an associate professor of economics at the University of Michigan. His research focuses on a range of topics on the economics of the criminal justice system. If you work in this area, you also know Mike is a very good public servant in terms of providing lots of resources and improving the quality and range of data available to criminal justice researchers, which you'll get a sense of today in his work on the direct and intergenerational effects of criminal history-based safety net bans in the U.S. So I'll let Mike take it away. Thanks for being here.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Thanks so much for having me today. This is really a great turnout. Today I'm going to be talking about safety net bans in the United States, individuals who otherwise could be eligible because of being low income and might benefit from getting access to safety net programs, but are not legally allowed to because of their criminal histories. This is joint work with James Reeves, who just graduated from Michigan or will be next week and is going to Denver. And then Kevin Schnapel, who's at SFU, and then Caroline Walker at the Census Bureau. And I have to say, this doesn't represent the official views of the Census Bureau or anything. I don't know what the federal government, their views are anymore, so who knows? We are in the process of finishing a new disclosure on this project. So this uses the FSRDC system. And so we're trying to finish something up maybe at the end of this week, probably more likely the end of next week. And so feedback at this point would be really great because we can still take it into account before kind of locking in our next set of results. Just to take it away. So the safety net, social safety net in the United States is a key policy lever for reducing poverty and improving household well-being. Nearly 1 in 8 individuals received food stamps in 2021, for example. Criminal histories can preclude individual participation in cash assistance, housing assistance programs. And because of really well-documented evidence on limiting employment opportunities, this could be particularly damaging to economically vulnerable families. This is an increasingly large and vulnerable segment of the population. Nearly 7% of the US population has a felony conviction by age 30, and 40% of children grow up in a household where an adult will face criminal charges at some point before that child turns 18. For minority communities, that's going to be even larger, something like 2/3 of those children. So it's the modal experience for some demographics in the United States. In this paper, we're examining the impact of criminal history-based bans from public assistance programs on benefit receipt, crime, labor market outcomes, and childhood well-being. So focusing both on the directly impacted justice involved individual, but also the intergenerational effects on their kids. And we're going to be leveraging a sharp change in assistance eligibility and a regression discontinuity framework. So the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act of 1996, PWORA, introduced the ability for states to permanently bar individuals from receiving TANF or SNAP assistance, which is colloquially sometimes referred to as food stamps, if they had a felony drug conviction on or after August 23rd, 1996. This is part of a large federal piece of legislation, which is famously associated with Bill Clinton saying that it was going to change poverty as we know it. Okay, so this introduced TANF, it introduced a variety of things. The only thing that's tied up specifically with this August 23rd, 1996 issue are these criminal history bans. Now,
this
yep.
only happened for like traditional welfare programs, but the EITC did not have this, right?
The EITC does not preclude individuals from receiving like a negative income tax credit with a criminal history based off your criminal history. There are other programs that do depend on this, things like HUD assistance can take into account both drug convictions and violent convictions. The Social Security Administration, some of their programs will depend on your criminal history, but the EITC, no.
That's the largest form of assistance today. That's changed over time.
That's correct. That's correct. Yeah. So I mean, this isn't a paper specifically about Aurora, but it is correct that through this legislation that occurred, this was part of a broad shift in the way that our safety net system operates in the United States, moving away from cash and in-kind assistance to tax credits for working families. And so there's been in the background of what we're talking about, everyone we're studying are going to be facing kind of this new environment which incentivizes individuals to work through the EITC. TANF is really not going to be part of this story because that's become such a small share of safety net assistance in general. But SNAP has expanded quite dramatically, especially in the later 2000s after Obama expanded the income range that was eligible. This is part of a broader shift of moving assistance and safety net assistance onto federal budgets and away from state budgets. But yeah, everyone's going to be exposed to this new environment, and we're basically studying variation that does or doesn't allow people to access some of these programs in this like more EITC focused world. Wait, so we are not the first people to look at this program. Llewellyn et al. Has studied this and found that there was no change in recidivism after the SNAP drug felony ban using data from the National Corrections Reporting Program. This is a data set that follows individuals entering and leaving prison. And so there's some critique of this, and that there's the letter of the law was based off of when your offense was committed, and that is not typically a kind of a piece of information that available in the NCRP. And so especially if you're trying to implement this in an RD framework, measurement error could lead to a spurious null result, which could be problematic. Yang and Cody Tuttle have other research designs. Cody is an RD focusing specifically on felony drug traffickers in Florida, and finds some short-run increase in recidivism in Florida. And Yang using a kind of a triple diff style study, looking at individuals reentering from prison using the NCRP data, also finds a decline in recidivism. Okay. Our contributions have a couple of different forms. One is that we're going to be broadening the study population as we think about the impacts of this policy beyond prisoners and drug traffickers. We're going to be looking at the universe of individuals convicted of felony drug convictions. Just to help frame that for those of you in the audience who don't focus on US crime issues, a felony drug crime is not going to be things like possession of marijuana. This is typically going to be things like possession of heroin, methamphetamines, other opiates, more serious drugs. Typically, for somebody who is facing their first felony drug conviction, usually only about 10% will go to prison. So the modal outcome is often community supervision when you're a first-time defendant, and then as you have repeat contact with the justice system, the likelihood that you end up in prison escalates. So we think that this is helpful in terms of broadening who we're looking at, a less negatively selected sample as we're trying to evaluate the effects of this policy. Second, we're going to be quantifying for the first time the relationship between being exposed to the ban and its actual impact on take-up. A lot of prior work has had to focus just on the reduced form relationship between being ineligible as a result of having an offense after the ban and recidivism, because the data just hasn't been linked. That you can study recidivism as an outcome because it's just basically showing up again in your crime data set. And so we'll be looking at that both in terms of kind of the direct effect on justice-involved individuals, the household spillovers to their romantic partners and children, as well as persistence of these bans after they've been repealed by states. We're going to expand the set of outcomes temporally beyond just short-run recidivism, like a year, to 1 to 20 years, as well as thematically including things like employment outcomes, measures of social emotional well-being and stress, for dependents and their romantic partners, as well as looking at the impacts on their children. The programs that the recipients who we think are probably most vulnerable and that these policies are really most intended to benefit because of the potential externalities on society of having children growing up in poverty. Yep.
Just a clarification on SNAP. So if a father is banned, does that ban apply to his offspring?
Legally, no. So we'll talk in more detail about this, exactly how this works. But if, let's say in my household, I have a felony drug conviction that makes me banned. If myself and my husband were applying for benefits for our family and my son, then in theory, my income and my husband's income will be added together to do the benefit calculation of what we'd be eligible for. And then I would be taken off as an eligible adult recipient. So my spouse and my child would get benefits, but my income would count against the benefit. So this does create an incentive for two-parent families to separate. Because the banned individual is only a drag on a potential benefit receipt without creating any benefits. Yep.
So sorry, so how do you deal with that? Because that means that what you're capturing is not going to be the effect of the money, it's the fact that it's inducing separation.
So we're gonna talk about that when we look at the children's outcomes, that we're going to be showing the impacts of the bans. And we think that there are multiple mechanisms through which that affects outcomes, both the disinvestment in children because of a contraction in budget constraints, as well as the potential social emotional turmoil that is occurring, as well as changes in peer mentorship, or not peer mentorship, relationships within the household that might be altering child trajectories. And we don't have a way of disentangling those things. Yeah, but those are all kind of part of the package. Okay. What we find, roughly 1 in 7 defendants do not take up assistance in a given year as a result of the ban. 1 in 3 defendants ever experience lower benefits over a follow-up period. So this is, the first statement is about just looking on average in a given year, the likelihood of taking up benefits. And this is trying to look more cumulatively the share of the population that is marginal at some point. So it is true that the majority of defendants are not on the cusp. They aren't going to try to look for these benefits, but roughly 1 in 3 will. Repealing these bans. So let's say the ban went into effect in 1997, but a state went and took it away in 2005, restoring benefits to these individuals. That really has no impact on restoring actual take-up patterns within the previously banned population. That could be either due to the fact that there's path dependence, that they've reorganized their lives economically such that they don't feel the need to apply for SNAP benefits. It could be because of misinformation on the applicant's part or the caseworker's part. We can't say which, but the fact is that after bans occur or are repealed, it does not appear that the newly restored population is returning to higher levels of take-up as we'd expect. 2 in 5 children, 40% of children of these directly impacted and justice-involved individuals have lower household benefit receipt as a result of the ban. So this is not an intended way that the program is supposed to work. All of these children should be qualifying and should be taking up this program, but either because of caseworker or applicant misinformation, the children are not getting access to this benefit as they're growing up. In terms of direct impacts to defendants and their romantic partners, we generally find really muted effects, which somewhat contrast with the work by Cody Tuttle and Crystal Yang. We can rule out impacts to criminal charges that are more or less are larger than 2 percentage points and employment effects that are larger than 2 percentage points. So there's a really muted effect that we're seeing in terms of crime responses or employment. We do find maybe some potential evidence of a reduction in criminal activity among romantic partners, which could be a sign of like a deterrence effect, that if that you see that your boyfriend has gotten banned from safety net assistance, you become more careful about ensuring that you yourself don't lose access to the program. But if we were to do multiple hypothesis corrections, we would not. That would be marginally insignificant. And so I don't want to emphasize that point too much. In contrast, however, we see really clear evidence of negative spillovers to young children. These children end up spending fewer years in two-parent households while they're growing up. They show higher elevated rates of cognitive and emotional distress, and lower rates of high school graduation. And as we follow them into early adulthood, they're experiencing lower earnings in industries that tend to require a high school degree or more. They are less likely to live in low poverty neighborhoods, and which and it's really awkward phrasing. It's because of the way we put our index together that they're all trying to be in the same, like, positive or negative. They're more likely to live in high poverty neighborhoods. And ironically, these kids that were removed from SNAP under the idea that we should be taking benefits away from people who are potentially abusing the system, that they're going to be using public benefit dollars to buy drugs, they're getting kicked off, and then their children are then coming back and using SNAP at higher rates, which goes in the exact opposite direction from theories of welfare dependence. It's actually that welfare is a program, at least in this case, that is supporting the transition out of poverty within this population.
Could you remind us the magnitude of the effect of being in a romantic relationship or being in a two-parent household?
The impact on the likelihood of growing up in a two-parent household, I haven't said that yet, and I don't know that statistic off the top of my head, and I apologize for that, but we will get to it soon. Yeah. Okay. Let's talk a bit about background data, design, and sample. So PROWORA excluded groups from participating in assistance programs. Section 115 permanently banned individuals who committed a felony drug offense on or after August 23rd, 1996 from ever receiving SNAP or TANF benefits. This was part of the war on drugs, as I was previously discussing. The framing of this was that individuals were using public benefit dollars, taxpayer dollars, to feed their drug habits. And this was a waste of taxpayer dollars, and that we need to remove undeserving low-income individuals from these programs in order to avoid this waste of money. This was applied to use, possession, and distribution offenses. And as I said, this was addressing legislators' concerns about public assistance benefits being used to purchase illicit narcotics. But Section 115 also allowed states to modify or opt out of this ban. And at this point now, nearly every state has either modified their bans or opted out completely. This is something that's almost entirely gone from TANF and SNAP today. The typical modifications include restricting ban-eligible offenses. Like in the instance of Florida, they only applied the ban to drug traffickers, which is a subset of drug distribution crimes. People who are dealing in very serious, like large quantities of drugs. Another common restriction is removing the ban, but requiring drug testing or treatment programs amongst applicants with drug convictions. So you have to maintain like clean urine samples in order to continue receiving benefits, or imposing only temporary disqualification periods following a drug conviction. Like you are not allowed to apply for benefits for 5 years, but then you can come back. And then when I say apply, you would have to be excluded from the benefit calculation, but the rest of your household would be eligible. Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about why these bans are gone? Did states kind of have a sense that they were bad, or were they responding to some other administrative costs?
So the initial wave of states that repealed them were all Democratic, more or less. And so I think that there was some concern about the federal government taking kind of the safety net in a direction that they disagreed with philosophically. Amongst conservative places, I think that although I'm not an expert, I haven't gone through kind of the full analysis of this. I think there was some popular backlash against these restrictions, and that there kind of was compelling evidence that there were vulnerable families that were getting harmed as a byproduct of these programs, especially during the Great Recession.
Yeah, so thinking about some of the case studies that are motivating.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess there remains an open question about whether the repeals are effective at restoring access. I mean, it's an open question about whether or not they actually decrease take up to begin with. We don't, so it, yeah, obviously it would be a no. So this is the policy variation in our sample, which we're going to be looking at, which is a subset of states in the US. All of these states have had some sort of repeal that have been implemented, and we aren't looking at all 50 states because this depends on CJARS, which I'll talk about probably in a little bit, but it's a data collection effort that I started that's harmonizing criminal justice data from around the United States, and we're working as fast as we can, but we don't have crime data from every single jurisdiction. It's a very large effort. So these are the states that we have sufficient historical information on criminal convictions that we can look in a neighborhood around the 1996 discontinuity and then follow their outcomes over time. So these include Arizona, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, North Dakota, New Jersey, Oregon, and Texas. Some of these repeals, I think, are a little bit of patting themselves on the back that aren't really too productive in practice. Like Texas was very proud of their repeal in 2015. Which basically said that as long as you only ever had one felony drug conviction, you could get back onto public assistance programs. But the minute you had two, lifetime ban goes back into effect. So, you know, how it's, you know, once you're involved in the justice system, for some subset, like they cycle through fairly often. And so the likelihood of being able to restrict to just one felony drug conviction is somewhat challenging. There are two places that I want to highlight because they're just a little weird. When you're going to look at them, you're going to say, like, New Jersey, why are you including this? They had a full repeal pretty soon, and they restricted to just distribution offenses in 1997. New Jersey had a quirk of a general assistance program that they were operating, which is not a federally funded program, a state-funded program, that they had a drug conviction ban in place using the same discontinuity that was in place until 2022. And because of potential programmatic spillovers between general assistance and SNAP and TANF, we're going to include that as a state, and it's a little hard to think about exactly when the repeal happened. The other state is Oregon, which had a full repeal almost immediately. Almost every other state that that meets this condition, we do not include in our analysis because there's more or less no point at which people were banned. The reason we include Oregon here is because the state of Washington did have a ban in place until the mid-2000s. And because of potential misinformation that could flow across the border between Washington and Oregon, given the shared metro area in Portland, we included, I mean, we can just say observationally, you see a discontinuity in the take-up of SNAP in Oregon, and so we decided to include it. But otherwise, you can see kind of the range of states we're looking at. Fine. So this is a project that is being conducted in the Federal Statistical Research Data Center network, which I am assuming everyone here is familiar with. This is a secure environment where you can link secure or sensitive and confidential microdata at the individual level. And so we're incorporating a lot of different types of data in this project. First is CJARS, which is what I mentioned. This is a data platform that we started about 10 years ago that is collecting arrests, adjudications, and periods of correctional confinement, whether institutional or community-based, across the United States. And it's expanding as we go. And if you're interested in doing research on the justice system and its intersections with socioeconomic life cycle dynamics, I encourage you to check it out. Our website, cjars.org. It's freely available, at least right now, freely available to anyone who has a approved FSRDC project. So you can access that at no cost. We also link that with IRS W-2 tax filings to measure employment and earnings. We have some administrative data on SNAP. This comes from mainly the 2010s period, which is a little late and only for 3 states. So it's going to be kind of unique in the ways that we use this. This is not going to be our primary measure of safety net usage. We also are using the Numinant and best race file, and this is not some eugenics thing. It's incorporating all of the different measurement sources that the Census Bureau has to give its best guess at what they think your racial identification is. We're using household crosswalk data that we pulled together in a prior paper looking at the intergenerational spillover of the justice system. And this is basically using all of the data available through the federal government to identify where everyone lives every year and who their major kinship relationships are. And we're using that to identify the likelihood of growing up in these two-parent households and the number of years that they're living together. And then also HUD and Medicaid enrollment data, which I'm not going to show, but it's in the paper. We test to make sure that there aren't spillovers onto those other programs, and we measure no change in them. Then we also link to ACS data and the current population survey. ACS is from 2005 forward. And pretty soon we're going to have through, I think, the 2022 wave of that, which will be great because we'll be able to measure those kids even further. And then the CPS allows us to go back to 1997. I just want to caution or temper everyone's expectations on this early period. The CPS is a much smaller sample than the ACS. And so our ability to say something about anything that happens just in the late 1990s is going to be essentially undisclosable by census rules because the sample size is very small. Okay. So we're going to estimate a series of regression discontinuity designs around the time of disqualification cutoff date. In this specification, we have kind of this post. Your offense occurred after parole went into effect, the running variable of the offense date, and then kind of the interaction of the post and the running variable. We're going to allow kind of these trends to vary by state to provide more flexibility to what's occurring in each specific location. And it has the usual identifying assumptions, density, and covariate smoothness, which are satisfied. And I am more than happy to click through to these, but in the interest of time, I'm going to keep going. As well as an exclusion restriction. And here, I think that the way that we think about the exclusion restriction is that there's really no other change in eligibility that's occurring at this cutoff. It's not that, like, for instance, when we're talking about the kid outcomes, that we're saying it's through the cash alone. But we're saying like cash changes, family structure changes, these are all derivative of eligibility changes. And then we use a constant bandwidth of 330 days, but we have the whole range of robustness checks and functional form checks in the paper. Yeah.
Talk about why you use a regression discontinuity design in this situation, or is it cutoff date?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Sometimes another version of that I get is like, why not do this in a diff and diff? And I think one of the challenging things to think about in that setting is exactly what was raised earlier by Juliana, is that the whole environment of the safety net system is changing quite dramatically over the course of the 90s and into the early 2000s. And I feel more comfortable evaluating the impact and eligibility holding fixed the outcome environment, the policy environment that people are living in. Because as you're approaching the discontinuity, basically the follow-up period is approaching more or less the exact same share of time that you're living in the post-parole world. In a diff and diff kind of world, it's kind of different what we're assuming about kind of the change in trajectory that's occurring between kind of affected and unaffected groups that I think would be a stronger assumption than what we're making here. Yeah, Yotam.
So you have about 60,000 individuals here. What were the sample restrictions? Like, how did you construct and focus on these individuals?
Yeah, so these are going to be individuals who are experiencing their first felony drug conviction, or it would be the first relevant conviction given the state. So in Florida, for instance, it would just be drug traffickers. In the window of 330 days before and after August 22nd, or August 23rd, 1996, in the subset of states that we're looking at. And so once you start to apply all of these sample restrictions, it narrows down quite quickly.
And when you say it first, it means that you look only at individuals that you can have coverage, only at cohorts you have coverage from age 18 onwards.
No, we aren't doing, I think it's like the first observable one that we have in our data. We don't want to, because like recidivism theoretically could be endogenously influenced. We don't want to count the same person multiple times along the RD. So like have me show up like multiple times in the post period because I got cut up from assistance and all of a sudden that's skewing the sample. We don't have to have it be literally the first time. It's just that we only want people to show up once in this kind of 2-year window, and judge them once, if that makes
And
sense.
do you make any restrictions at the cohorts, like based on your learning? Because
No.
the criminal justice data doesn't have coverage only for certain cohorts. So like if, for example, you have coverage from the age of 22 for me,
That's right.
then I don't know if like this is my first offense. or-
No, that's true. So this is not a restriction on literally your first offense. This is a restriction on our first observable offense within the data that we have. Yeah, that's an important clarification. And so for some of these individuals, they'll be a little bit older than in other jurisdictions where we might have more historical data, which skews this sample a little bit younger. But I don't think that creates a problem methodologically for the results. What we just want to avoid is like having people showing up in the analysis sample multiple times. In theory, you could do it even just like the first time that you show up within the window of the RD. What that creates is like a really like kind of wonky picture that doesn't look great, at least to referees. But also I would say to myself where you have a very skewed sample, the characteristics at the very start look really different relative to as you move through the rest of the sample window. But that would still theoretically satisfy the RD assumptions because characteristics meet at the discontinuity. Yeah.
When did the law pass? I may have missed it. But I know that, so the cutoff date is in August.
Yeah, the law was passed in August. And so the actual implementation happened a few months later as states started to roll this out.
Okay, so there was no, like, because I was thinking about the density check and there's no sort of deterrence effect.
No, we don't see any deterrence effect. Yeah. I think like the way I think about the like story of this project is like there are these young men who are kind of living their lives and are involved in illicit drug use. Their thoughts on family formation, their thoughts on safety net usage really are not at the forefront of their minds. They are not really influenced by federal laws like pro rata. And that's consistent with a broad range of evidence suggesting limited deterrence value of like really severe changes in potential sentencing outcomes. They experience these convictions, they keep going. They go and find partners. They have kids. We find that there is no impact on the likelihood of matching with a partner or the likelihood of having a kid. But then something happens in their lives. They lose a job, their spouse loses a job, and they need to turn to safety net assistance. And at that point, they realize that I have this characteristic that is influencing my ability to access the safety net system. So it's something that is very like clearly happening that's influencing their later life activity, but I don't think it's something that's fully internalized until later on after they get out of prison, if they've spent time in prison, after they've started a family and realize that this is something they need and then can't access. Yeah.
Before, like, when do you measure them?
So these are at the time of the offense. And these are going to appear different than what we see over here in terms of the partner characteristics. And what is going on here is that this is conditioning on being matched to a partner, which is if you looked at it is not that our men. So I'm largely the like directly impacted individuals are going to be men. So I'm just going to refer to them as men. It's not that our young men aged like 30 are systematically having older relationships with older women. It's just that the men who are matching are older. And then they've matched with women who are roughly their same age or younger than they are.
Half those men have children at sentencing, so how many are already like pulling SNAP?
Sorry, that is not the correct interpretation of this, and I apologize, that's unclear. We match half of them ever to a child. The share that have a child that's age 5 or older at the time of sentencing is 20%. So there are not that many men that are old enough to yet have older children in our sample to be able to follow them, but we'll try to do the best that we can. Yeah, Till.
Sorry, can you go back to the RG?
Yep.
So are you looking at the fences around 1996?
Yes.
And then the long-term outcomes of these people, essentially?
Yep, that's exactly right.
But the story you're told would suggest another design where you look at event studies later on, you have the actual data, say 2010. Right, you look at sort of people who experience a shock at a certain stratum, and then see how convicted and non-convicted are you.
Yeah, that would be another really interesting research design that could be a nice complement. We don't have application behavior, and so it would be hard to say, okay, like we're going to look at the cohort of people who apply for benefits, some of whom are eligible and some of whom aren't. But we could entirely do what you're talking about let's say like a mass layoff design and say, let's look at the people who are just to the left of the discontinuity versus just to the right and see how they differentially respond to that kind of economic shock happening in their life. We haven't done that, but that is something that we could theoretically do.
But is it important that the conviction happens around before and after 1996?
Yes.
Because a conviction before 96 wouldn't count.
Yes. Yep. That's literally what's on the form. The form, when you apply for benefits, say, do you have a felony conviction for a drug offense on or after August 23rd, 1996? Anything before, you don't have to report. Yeah.
The S subscripts on the last slide.
Yep.
So gamma and delta have S subscripts.
Yeah.
Alpha and beta also need to be state specific.
So that's a great question. So we do have state fixed effects. So effectively alpha is subscripted by S. Beta here is just pooling across all states, and we're doing that for power reasons. In the paper, we show state specific effects, which essentially just is creating a beta S. But the only point of this is to create flexibility around kind of state specific trends, given some of the quirks of our data and how like the historical nature of the data varies by state. And so the way that some of these things could be trending across the running variable might vary by state.
Because if they all had S's, we could just think of it as state specific RT.
That's right.
Yeah.
But as you'll see in a moment, we often have to rely on merging to the ACS, which is a repeated cross-section of 1% of the US population, which intersected with our 60,000 people is gonna leave us pressed for power. So we're gonna pool all of our states together for kind of improving our power. So we are including their first observed date around that window, and then they're included in the sample as they move forward, regardless of whether or not. So let me go back over here. We're only considering the offense date of that first observed offense. And then repeat offense could occur over here on the left-hand side as an outcome. And that could influence, so for instance, let's say that you were program eligible, and then 5 years later, you have a new felony drug offense that could make you program ineligible, which would then bias our results in terms of the first stage down. Yeah. We actually don't, we did look at like the degree of reoffense within this population, and for whatever reason, it's very low. Yeah.
So it seems like this program kind of increases the cost of a felony conviction. And it seems like a reasonable response by judges would be to start around the threshold using diversion programs. Are you surprised that that's not happening?
So I've done work on diversion programs, and so I appreciate you raising that. No, I don't find that surprising at all. I don't think that the way that felony courts work in practice is that there's a lot of thought that goes into any individual case. The majority of cases are resolved through plea negotiations that experience roughly like 5 minutes of time in court total. I don't think that there's a lot of sensitivity, especially during this cultural moment around this population. So I love where your mind and your heart is at, but no, I don't think that happened. And empirically, we don't see that occurring. Yeah. These are all really great questions. Right. Okay, so yeah, we've already kind of talked about a number of these characteristics. We just emphasize for the kids sample, for those that are born under the age of 5, so this is going to be kids that were in existence at the time of the events, that were between ages like, a day old and 5 years old, or were going to be born in years after, which again, we've tested and there's no observable differences in their likelihood of occurring or their characteristics. On average, they're going to be about 18 years old at the end of our study period. So we're going to follow them as far as we can, but it becomes really, like, we aren't going to be able to say what their permanent lifetime income is at age 30. They're just too young. In our newest disclosure, we're adding in data through like 2022, which will help somewhat with this, but we're just kind of constrained on that. The older ones get much older, but they're just very few, and they're it's kind of a long right tail, and so there's just a lot of variance within these older kids. This is the geographic representation of our sample. We go to 120, is that right? More or less. All right, cool. You can see that Texas represents a large share of our records, 40%. It's not the majority, but it's by far the lion's share of our records are coming from Texas. I just want to highlight this kind of quirk about Cody's paper. Florida should be a large number of records, but it's only 2% because of the way that they restricted their ban immediately to just drug traffickers. This isn't even just distribution of drugs. It's like heavy volume, like you're driving a truck of drugs and you get caught. We also have a lot of representation from Arizona, North Carolina, and Oregon, and New Jersey, and to a lesser extent, Georgia and North Dakota. This is not because Georgia isn't a big state, but we have limited personally identifying information available in Georgia. And so our pick rate, which is our ability to link into the Census Bureau, is much more compromised in Georgia than it is in other jurisdictions. Okay. And North Dakota is wonderful in the way that they share so much data with us, but it's just such a small state. God bless North Dakota. Okay. So let's quantify the first stage. So there's been a lot of talk about how this affects people's crime behavior. I think it's really important to think, like, actually, did this actually, like, do we have evidence that this affected the mechanism through which we primarily thought that this would be influencing crime in the first place? And we largely find that the answer is yes. To measure this, what we're doing is we're looking at the probability of SNAP receipt in a household unit in the ACS. And we're stacking all of the repeated cross-sections up together and then mapping them onto a running variable, where this is relative to the time of the PROWARA implementation. So prior to, for individuals who committed their felony drug offense just prior to the signing of PROWARA, so like late summer, you have your picnic or whatever, and you have heroin on you, you get caught, but it's not yet Labor Day. You're in this bucket, and then over the next 20 years, your likelihood of being on SNAP or being in a household receiving SNAP is about 35, 37 percentage points. Okay. You move just a week, a day later, it's after Labor Day, that likelihood has dropped down to like 27%. Okay. Now, you might say, I don't understand. All of these people are ineligible. Like, why is this not zero? The way that the ACS asks the question about SNAP receipt is at the household level, because it's a household level benefit. Okay, so this is showing that these individuals are living in a household where somebody is getting SNAP benefits. Now, I will say that we've done the exercise on individuals who are living by themselves, and it doesn't go to zero. And so it could be that like there's lying occurring, or we could have mismeasurement in terms of how we're merging the data together. The process of creating PICs is a probabilistic match process. And so it could be that we matched our criminal justice data to the wrong ACS record. It could be that there is just inaccurate data linkages occurring, or that they aren't actually checking people's criminal histories when people are applying. So there are a variety of reasons why this is non-zero, but the fact is that depending on just, a week plus or minus of when you committed your offense, that had a pretty large change on your 20-year propensity to take up the safety net program. Yeah.
Have we been able to compare for the subsample where you have the SNAP data from the states? The difference between the self-reports and ACS and the SNAP data?
I'm going to get to that in a second. So thank you. That's a great question. Okay. On the right-hand side is now incorporating the families. And you can see that the level has gone up, right? There are going to be more kids, more women now involved in the sample. So overall benefits are take up is going up. But you still see this discontinuity occurring. It's shrunk somewhat, but we're still measuring something like a 7 percentage point drop in the likelihood that households are taking up SNAP benefits conditional on being in like a household with children present, which is not how this program is supposed to work. Or maybe that was the intent of how it was supposed to work, but that was never set out loud. Yeah.
Clarification, you said in the ACS, the outcome is always a family level outcome. So
Yeah.
it's just a difference in like the unit of observation, weighting of families.
Oh, in terms of the left versus the right. So this is going to be all just the justice involved individuals. Then this is going to be bringing in potentially their co-parents and children that might not be co-residing together. So we're going to be following individuals in time, because let's say the justice involved individual goes back to prison, we still want to see what happens to their child and their romantic partner.
Mike, can you just set it for emphasis? I think you said this, but I forgot. How many years out are these outcomes measured?
This is measured between the CPS and the ACS from 1997 through 2019. So this is the average. So this should be interpreted as the average probability over the next 20 years per year.
Another clarification question that you may have said. If you measure this at the household level, how do you get differences in family and individual impacts? Because you have merged a family that both happen to be in the ACS, but in different households in the ACS. So the amount of SNAP by family members can differ. Is that?
Yeah, that's more or less right. So like, again, using this example, so let's say that when we merge to the ACS, I never show up because I went to prison, and the ACS has a really weird way of dealing with sampling on carceral facilities that isn't worth talking about, but you should never use the ACS to measure the extent of incarceration ever. But my husband and my child do respond to the ACS at some point. So I won't show up in this graph, but they will show up in this graph. Right? That's how these things can differ. Okay. Now, if you recall, basically all of these states had some form of repeal that occurred. This is now splitting our follow-up period to times when the repeals were occurring or sorry, times when the bans were in effect, in the light gray in the circles, and then times after the states had repealed these bans, which are the solid black lines and X's. You'll notice that overall there's a level shift up of take up. I would not interpret that as an effect of the repeal. This is the fact that all of these repeals happened later in time, which are going to be more disproportionately exposed to the Obama era expansion and eligibility, which just broadened participation in SNAP in the United States overall. What you can see is that more or less, there's no difference. This doesn't work, but that's okay. There's no difference in the discontinuity. It just shifts up in terms of the lower take up after the program. So while we can't say whether or not kind of going forward, people newly receiving felony drug convictions after these repeals occurred experience different trajectories. Maybe there's like some specific path dependence that occurred because you applied for benefits and were denied, and so you just never go back to government offices. But at least for this sample, we can say pretty clearly that they didn't return to benefit receipt trajectories that we would have expected. Yeah, name.
Same for the states that totally opted out versus the ones that make the modifications but still require people to pay for the drug tests and things like that.
I don't know that off the top of my head. Yeah, that's a good question. But I don't know that off the top of my head. Okay. All right, so this is going to this question about survey versus administrative measures of safety net usage. There's been critiques raised of the usefulness of surveys for measuring household income and poverty rates and the accuracy with which individuals respond about their take-up of benefits. I think some of this has been framed maybe not in the most productive way. I think that some of these discrepancies can come from procedures that the Census Bureau is using, like imputation of values. And it's not something nefarious that households are engaged in, but simply that they just didn't respond to a question. That said, we created a custom scaling to account for this in our data, where we used the set of ACS responses that overlap with our administrative data to look at the degree of misreporting within our setting. And we find something very similar with what Bruce Myers found in other cases, where essentially there's no real false positives. Nobody's claiming they receive SNAP benefits when they don't receive SNAP benefits. There isn't like confusion about that. What does happen are some false negatives where a household is receiving benefits, but they don't report it on the survey document. And it could be that maybe the head of household that's responding, or whoever the ACS respondent doesn't know or realize that they're a recipient of the benefits. But we do find that kind of fact. And so what we end up doing is scaling up our estimates by 0.184 to account for this measurement error in our first stage. And that's already been applied in the estimates that you previously saw. So the actual RDs were slightly smaller. Okay. The second thing that we want to think about is that we aren't totally comfortable with the idea of using this contemporaneous first stage, the average likelihood of taking up benefits in a given year, because we think that there could be dynamic impacts of program receipt. For instance, we don't think it just matters whether or not a kid is getting SNAP benefits at age 17 or 18 when they're getting ready to graduate from high school on the likelihood that they graduate from high school. It probably also mattered whether they got benefits when they were 5 and 6 and 7. And so in order to account for that, before I get to that, this is important because SNAP usage is irregular and inconsistent. This is using the administrative data that we have and looking at the average, the different lengths of spill receipt. And what you can see is the modal experience is 2 years or less of continuous usage of SNAP at a given point in time. And while, yes, there is a right tail of individuals who are continually receiving SNAP benefits, that is not the most common occurrence. And so if we think that there are infrequent events like a job loss that trigger the need for SNAP, we might be underestimating the size of the true marginal population when averaging across years. Okay. It might be that like the 1 year that I measured in the ACS, I'm like ineligible, but I had a job that year, so I didn't try to get benefits. But the year before, when I wasn't measured, I did need benefits and I got denied. All right, so what we're gonna do is estimate year by year first stages, and then combine with a weighted sum to capture the likelihood that an observation was marginal for the first time in our population. And so this is basically summing up. The weights are defined as kind of the flows in the caseload size that we're measuring based off of this distribution. That the likelihood that basically it's like the recycling rate of the caseload from 1 year to the next. So accounting for the number of people that entered as well as left, and trying to add in the share of whatever first stage is left, and the next year, the year following, yada, 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 that would be important to account for. So as you can see over here, as you move forward in time, it's an increasingly small share of individuals that we estimate would be showing up in the SNAP caseload for the first time ever, right? We mostly get it within the first 5 years, but we kind of do it for the full trajectory that we can get. And so that gives us a total estimate of roughly 0.32, which gives us that 1 in 3 number, as opposed to scaling by 0.14. And that matters if we're going to go and take like this estimate and apply an IV to scale our effects, because we're either multiplying by like 7 or by like 3. Okay. Yeah.
I know that you've got to combine things because
Yes.
you're linking to the ACS, you've got smaller samples, but it seems like there might be real variation in sort of the effects, the treatment effects, relative to the time, like when it's first happened, right? Relative to the dynamics over time, and you're just it's average.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering if you can do more parametrically to try to model that. That's kind of a different exercise than what you're describing right here. Or maybe that's coming.
Do you mean in terms of take up or in terms of like the impacts on people's
The
lives?
long run, so short term versus long run impacts. You're kind of giving us this estimates like on the floor, but is that something that's fading over time, but was the short term effect much larger than your estimate? So that seems to be really important to interpret.
Yeah, I agree. I think that is a really important question that we could push more on. I need to. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I mean, I think like it would be really cool to combine kind of part of what Till was talking about with this RD and thinking about like the initiating event of when somebody tries to get access to benefits, because we're basically like, we have this population level status of eligibility, but it really only gets activated once they try to get benefits. It's unfortunate that we don't have application behavior, but if we had something that helped us pinpoint, okay, this is now in acute need, and this is how their lives are evolving relative to this, that would be really helpful for the adults, because it could be like we're just looking at over a really long period of time and we're getting null results. And we're also getting null results when we look at like just 1 year outcomes, because they aren't yet at a point where they need benefits. But if we could really isolate their response relative to when they need it, that could be very helpful. For the kids, yeah, that becomes a complicated thing to try to think about. But yeah, it's definitely worth pushing on that. Okay, so let's talk about some outcomes. And I think we can probably go through this quickly so that we can have discussions. For the justice involved individuals, just to talk theoretically, we think that there's an income effect occurring here. So, you know, individuals are losing access to a benefit program that could decrease their household budget constraint, which could incentivize them to engage in income generating criminal activity. And I've done work suggesting that occurs, you know, relative to the SSI context. This is a much smaller benefit, and it's used much less frequently. So it's not necessarily clear that it would have the same kind of dependence dynamics that we saw in the SSI setting. It could also incentivize more work because of the contraction in benefit constraints. But there's also been really interesting work suggesting that kind of some of the job search requirements associated with safety net programs, or at least the modern incarnation of safety net programs, support people engaging with the labor market. And so we could see a decrease in employment because now individuals don't have to fill out X number of applications every week in order to maintain their benefits. In terms of romantic partners, we have kind of the same dynamics going on with income effects. We have the added prediction of specific deterrence that maybe individuals are particularly aware of how this program works because they are partnered with an individual with a disqualifying condition. And so they specifically avoid felony drug convictions. It could be that that spills over to other types of criminal activity as well. And without trying to get ahead of ourselves, because we see this change in household structure, it could be that there's breakups or differences in peer influence that now that they're no longer with their justice-involved romantic partner, that changes their own criminal trajectory. Finally, for children, there's going to be a contraction in household resources that could harm child development and long-run outcomes. As a lot of work has previously shown, there's also the change in household circumstances. This could increase family stress and instability, which would potentially worsen outcomes, although there is also the argument that maybe children would be better off without having their justice-involved father present in the household. That's a theoretical statement. I'm not saying that I agree with that statement. Okay. So we're going to consider impacts across three major groups. For the focal individuals, these are the people with the convictions and their romantic partners. We're looking at future criminal charges and convictions, employment and earnings. And then this response to the ACS question that I really love. It's part of the disability battery of questions. So it's really more geared towards the aging population. But the question reads something along the lines of, and I'm sure someone here is going to know it better than I will and correct me, but it's like, has this person had struggled with focusing, concentrating, or making decisions as a result of a mental, emotional, or physical condition? Right? It's supposed to be something measuring cognitive decline. In prior work, we've seen that this is highly common to be reported for children in justice-involved households. And so we think that it's measuring something more than just cognitive decline, that it's being interpreted by households as a marker of potential emotional stress or mental stress. For children, we have a broader range of outcomes, which are going to become even broader after our newest disclosure. And I'm so sad that I can't talk about them today. But we're going to look at household structure and youth, high school dropout rates, the same ACS question, employment and earnings charges through age 22, and then this really weirdly ambiguous named category of household economic circumstances, which is a catch-all category for like the neighborhood that you're living in, whether or not you're taking up public assistance programs yourself, that kind of stuff. Yeah.
For the romantic partners, are they linked prior to the offense date, or should we think about this as also potentially operating through like selection of romantic partners?
Yeah, so we are including romantic partners and children that occur potentially endogenously after the offense date. We've done testing to look at whether or not there's imbalance in the likelihood of these partnerships or children being formed, as well as the characteristics of these partnerships, and we don't see any change. And so this kind of goes back to what I was saying, that I think that like this thing happens in their life. They don't realize that their eligibility has changed. They're moving through life, forming relationships, having families, and then when the need for safety net assistance arises, this is a shock that comes up and they realize, oh, shit, this isn't great. So that's our interpretation of the data, but it would be entirely plausible that if individuals were screening on future safety net eligibility when making their romantic partnering decisions, that there could be imbalance in this. Yeah. Okay. So we're going to create a summary index for adult and child outcomes because we're testing a lot of stuff and we have a relatively limited sample. And so this is going to help safeguard ourselves against kind of data mining and multiple hypothesis testing. We've gotten feedback that this index is kind of maybe hard to interpret because we're just throwing everything in. So this is going to become multiple indices, but that's not for today. We're going to standardize each outcome to have mean 0 and variance 1, orient them so that Y is good. That's going to lead to some awkward phrasing that I will struggle with because it's hard to say you decrease the likelihood of living in a low poverty neighborhood, but take it as is. And they're just equally weighted. We didn't try to stack the deck in our favor. So thematically, we tried to include the same kind of types of outcomes the same number of times. So like maybe an earnings and employment margin, as well as a crime likelihood in total number of crimes, something like that, so that we aren't kind of skewing it towards one set of outcomes. And so this is for the justice involved individuals. This is showing their change in the likelihood of having a future criminal charge. Note that recidivism in this population is quite high. 2/3 of these individuals will have a future criminal charge at some point. Their employment rates are modest. This is being measured with W-2 earnings. So these are information returns. It does not depend on tax filing behavior. So this is going to be showing any positive earnings in a given year. I think we actually restricted it to being earnings over $1,000. I can't remember if we applied that restriction. I think we did. So it's not just like random, very small amounts of earnings, but I would be careful in interpreting it as saying like 40% of these people are okay. They could still have very modest earnings. There's no real kind of discontinuity occurring here. And then we pull everything with the index, including other outcomes. We see no change for the justice involved individuals. This is showing the same set of figures, but now just for the romantic partners. Yep. It's gonna go back over here.
Sorry if I missed it.
No, it's okay. 40%. Sorry?
I'm just wondering if it changes that.
It does not change at the cutoff.
It doesn't change.
It doesn't change at the cutoff. And I'm sure we have an appendix figure that I can show you if you'd like to see it visually, but it does not change at the cutoff. Do you want me to?
No.
Okay. Okay. No, it's fine. No, it doesn't change at the cutoff. Okay. I've gone too far. So this is the romantic partners. So here on this first one, we have like marginally significant at the 10 percentage point level, reduction of about 2 percentage points, the likelihood of having a future criminal charge. This is off of a baseline mean of around, let's say like 26, 27%. So it's not a trivial reduction. It's women in general have lower rates of contact with the justice system, but this could also just be a spurious outcome. So I want to be really cautious on over-interpreting this, but it wouldn't be surprising if there was some sort of deterrence effect occurring here because of how direct the information is kind of being made available within the household potentially. We don't see really any change in the employment rates. And then when we pull everything together, we see no change in the partner index either. So that also, again, cautions me against over-interpreting this criminal charge, because typically differences in criminal activity and charges co-vary with other socioeconomic outcomes. Yep.
This might be too in the weeds, but how do you deal with multiple partners? A long period of time.
Yeah, I think that we include them all. Yeah, I don't think, and I'm trying to remember whether or not in this we weight it back so that multiple partners get down weighted so that it's kind of weighted at the JII level. I think that's what we do, but I need to look back at the paper to confirm. I apologize. Yeah.
Since most of the proposals apply female, do they have a higher rate of SNAP usage than the main sample in general? I'm just thinking about being more sensitive.
Yeah, they totally do. And we saw that in the first picture when we added those household members in, the level went up. And so for sure, this is a group that will be much more sensitive potentially to SNAP eligibility. And it's more likely that they might have prior experience with this program. Yep. Okay. So to me, like getting to that point in the project, it was just like, gosh, what is going on? There's like such a clear first stage of like changes in take up of this program. And this is not a population that's like flush with financial resources. We're seeing this like very modest to no long run adult response to the bans. And it could be that it's like we aren't like the temporal window around which we're following people is just too like I want to say the word dilated, but that's not the right word. Like diffuse. It's like we aren't capturing the moment that they need the benefits. And maybe like that's what's going on. The other thing that we've thought about is that we're studying a population where their scarring effects of criminal activity are probably already well ingrained, right? This is not a population that has a lot of access to the labor market such that in the absence of SNAP benefits, they could just switch into getting a job. There are very significant barriers for people who have criminal records and getting access to jobs. So it could be that there's limited capabilities for this study population to recalibrate their economic circumstances in response to these bans. Like they're the most economically vulnerable you could imagine. Yep.
Just thinking about what you were saying about the indices, one way you could try to divide up would be more malleable and model to age outcomes, like, because I can imagine the cognitive load stuff could be super reactive to this, whereas employment is really all pre-change.
Yeah. That's a good suggestion. Yeah, Naomi.
Another theory that people have is that for families, because you've been focusing a lot on men with partners, that even though there's a lower uptake on the benefits, because they're families and it only impacted that one person, they're able to pull together in ways that actually would cause stress because of the pooling. And so have you looked at single men and you also see no effects for single men who really have no other ability to.
Yeah, so we looked at that specifically to test a theory about kids. Which I'll just preview now because we're getting close to the end. The way that we were thinking about like the contraction in household resources, not to steal the punchline, but like kids are harmed as a result of this, is that like either the parents are maintaining their level of consumption and just shortchanging their kids. They're basically cutting the kids' consumption entirely and then maintaining their own. And for that, we look at the single men who don't have anyone to cut budget for, and they show very similar outcomes. And so we kind of rule out that potential mechanism. Instead, what we think it's that the kids are much more sensitive to these fluctuations in financial resources, which would be consistent with prior work, including lots of people in this room, or that it's like these household structure things. And we've talked a little bit about some of this issue about like their courses are kind of set, right? Like you can't change your human capital at this point. That's kind of done. All right, I'm going to go quickly because somehow the last 15 minutes went super fast. So let me just talk about these outcomes really quickly. So I'm going to show the summary index for the kids. And here we're separating by kids under 5 and then over 5. In future stuff, we're just going to pull them all together. But for the under 5 kids, you can see that they are taking like a clear step down in terms of their outcomes. And then as we go through the kind of series of outcomes, I'm going to show you one representative RD plot and then kind of thematically the related coefficients on the right-hand side. So this is the change in the likelihood of completing high school. So for those under 5, this is a decrease of about 12 percentage points. That's a really large decline. And so this is where we started getting really concerned about like, should we be multiplying these reduced form estimates by 7 or by 3? Like that makes a world of difference in terms of how reasonable we think these things are. This goes in line with declines in the likelihood of no cognitive difficulty. So the kids that are subject to the bans are more likely to report having problems focusing, concentrating, or making decisions as a result of a social emotional condition. They're also less likely to be in a two-parent household. So going back to that comment that you had earlier, it's like a fraction of a percent, but that's the average likelihood over all years from 0 to 18, or from whenever we observed the offense or they were born until 18. So probably like I'm gonna guess that's like a 2 percentage point decline per year. Okay. This is looking at median earnings. On median earnings, we don't see anything in particular. We do see suggestive evidence that they're moving out of industries or they're making less in industries that tend to require a high school degree. We see no change between these groups on criminal activity. But we do see kind of really clear emerging evidence of changes in lifetime trajectories, in that the kids who were not banned were more likely to live in neighborhoods with lower poverty rates, as well as live in neighborhoods with more high school completion rates or higher employment rates. These are all declines because it's the effect of the ban. Okay, and then on the last thing you can see that the not being banned increases again, I have to talk to the team about how we name these things. I know the results. It's just I always get screwed up with saying the negative and positive. Anyways, it decreases the likelihood of not having SNAP. So that means being banned increases the likelihood of SNAP taken. All right. Basically out of time, I just want to go through some potential mechanisms and conclude. So one is that there's the changes in the household environment. That's the decrease in SNAP increases parental stressors, splits households. There's like the programmatic reason why households should split in response to this, because the men are only dragging down the benefit receipt for the household. We can't differentiate that from changes in the household budget constraint, and it could be that the children are the residual claimants. And as I already mentioned, I don't think that we have evidence that supports that. Instead, what we think is probably more likely is that children are more sensitive to reductions in household resources. And this ties back to Heckman's concepts of sensitive and critical periods in human capital development. And this is consistent with prior work, showing that particularly amongst kids who aren't yet aged into school age, where other types of protective benefit programs might be kicking in, that they're particularly harmed. Okay, so 9 states have some form of safety net assistance ban in place. 39 states have ever employed some form of ban. Approximately 11 million individuals have received felony drunk convictions in the United States since August 22nd, 1996. Bans may not generate as strong negative crime outcomes as previously discussed in the literature, but we identify another critically important externality, the intergenerational impact on child development, which is going to stick with us for a much longer period of time. Policies to eliminate the bans should really be considering how to re-engage the newly re-eligible population. Maryland is a place, for instance, that we don't have in our data, but did a lot of work to do active outreach. And it seems like they've been successful with re-engaging the population. So we should be thinking about how to do that more systematically. And thanks so much. Apparently you can email James all of the comments.